The morning of October 27th, 1944, in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, a German patrol discovered something that made no sense. Among the bodies of American soldiers killed in the previous day's fighting, they found letters written in Japanese. Dog tags bore Japanese surnames. The faces of the dead men, when the patrol examined them closely, were Asian, yet these soldiers wore American uniforms, carried American weapons, and had fought with a ferocity that had cost the German 7th Army dearly. The German battalion commander, when informed of this discovery, initially suspected a mistake. Perhaps these were Korean or Chinese laborers pressed into American service. But the intelligence officers who examined the captured documents found something else entirely. These were American citizens, Japanese Americans, Nisei, as they called themselves. Second-generation immigrants fighting for the United States against Germany despite having no connection whatsoever to the European War. The German propaganda ministry had prepared for this. Leaflets were already being printed, designed to be dropped over American lines where these Japanese-American units operated. The message was simple and, from the German perspective, logical. You are fighting for a country that has imprisoned your families. Your parents sit behind barbed wire in American concentration camps while you die for Roosevelt's Jewish war. You are traitors to your blood. Surrender now, and Germany will treat you as prisoners of war with honor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The leaflets assumed these soldiers would see reason. The German command could not comprehend why men of Japanese ancestry would fight for America, particularly after what America had done to their community. It was, by any rational calculation, absurd. These Nisei soldiers should have been the most unreliable troops in the American army, the most likely to desert, the least motivated to fight. The Germans were convinced of this. They had built their psychological warfare strategy around this assumption. They were wrong. The unit that had just torn through German defensive positions in the Vosges was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and it would become the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in American military history. The story of how this happened, of how men the U.S. government considered potentially disloyal enough to imprison their families, became the soldiers who would earn more than 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor, begins not with heroism, but with betrayal, suspicion, and a question that thousands of young Japanese-American men had to answer for themselves. Why fight for a country that doesn't trust you? To understand the 442nd, you must first understand what happened on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, killing 2,403 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet. The attack did more than start a war. It transformed how white America viewed the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. These were not new immigrants. The Issei, the first generation, had arrived in America beginning in the 1880s, working as laborers on railroads, in mines, and on farms. By 1941, most were permanent residents who had built businesses, purchased property, and raised children. Their children, the Nisei, were American citizens by birth. They attended American schools, spoke English as their first language, and knew Japan only through family stories and occasional photographs. The day after Pearl Harbor, that ceased to matter. Newspaper editorials on the West Coast immediately questioned the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Popular columnist Henry McLemore wrote in the San Francisco Examiner, "I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. Herd 'em up, pack 'em off, and give 'em the inside room in the Badlands." Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them. The military establishment shared these suspicions. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, commanding the Western Defense Command, told a congressional committee in February 1942, "The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second- and third-generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. It therefore follows that along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. DeWitt's testimony ignored that not a single Japanese American had been charged with espionage or sabotage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had investigated the community thoroughly before the war and found no evidence of organized disloyalty. But facts mattered less than fear, and many historians now acknowledge long-standing racial prejudice that predated Pearl Harbor. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized military commanders to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. The language was deliberately vague, but everyone understood its target. Within weeks, the Western Defense Command issued proclamations requiring all persons of Japanese ancestry to report for evacuation from the West Coast. Families had as little as 48 hours to settle their affairs. They sold businesses for pennies on the dollar. They stored possessions with neighbors, many of whom would later claim the property as their own. They packed what they could carry and reported to assembly centers, usually county fairgrounds or racetracks, where they lived in converted horse stalls, while the government constructed more permanent facilities in remote interior locations. The camps the government built were concentrated in desolate areas. Manzanar in California's Owens Valley, surrounded by mountains and desert. Hart Mountain in Wyoming, where winter temperatures dropped below zero. Tule Lake in Northern California. Poston and Gila River in Arizona's deserts. Minidoka in Idaho. Rower and Jerome in Arkansas swamplands. Topaz in Utah. Grenada in Colorado. The War Relocation Authority, the civilian agency managing the camps, called them relocation centers. The people imprisoned there knew better. The facilities were surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and machine guns overlooked the perimeter. Armed military police patrolled constantly. Anyone attempting to leave without permission could be shot. The barracks were hastily constructed, single-story wooden buildings covered with tar paper. Each building was divided into 4 to 6 rooms, each room housing one family regardless of size. A typical room measured 20 feet by 25 feet. Families of 8 or more lived in these 500-square-foot spaces with no privacy, no running water, no cooking facilities. Furniture consisted of army cots, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and whatever the residents could construct from scrap lumber. Communal facilities served entire blocks of barracks. Residents walked to mess halls for meals, standing in line regardless of weather. They used communal latrines and showers with no partitions, no privacy, conditions that violated every norm of Japanese cultural modesty. In winter, wind blew through gaps in the walls. In summer, internal temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. The food was basic institutional fare. Canned vegetables, rice, bread, occasional meat. The government allocated 45 cents per person per day for food, compared to 50 cents for military prisoners of war. Meals were served at designated times. Families no longer ate together in the traditional manner. The social structure that had organized Japanese-American community life disintegrated under these conditions. Yet within these camps, young Nisei men faced a decision that would define their generation. In January 1943, the War Department reversed its policy of excluding Japanese Americans from military service. The government that had imprisoned these men's families now wanted them to volunteer to fight. The request came in the form of a loyalty questionnaire distributed to all adults in the camps. 2 questions would become infamous. Question 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" Question 28 asked, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization?" For the Issei, who were barred by law from becoming naturalized citizens. Question 28 was a trap. Answering yes meant renouncing their only citizenship, leaving them stateless. For the Nisei, both questions were insults. They were American citizens being asked to prove loyalty while imprisoned without charge or trial. The questions assumed disloyalty as the default condition requiring disproof. Despite the insult, thousands of Nisei men answered yes to both questions. They volunteered from behind barbed wire to fight for a country that had imprisoned them and their families. The reasons were complex and deeply personal. Some believed military service would prove their loyalty and secure better treatment for their community. Some felt genuine patriotism despite their circumstances. Some simply wanted out of the camps, even if it meant risking death. Some were motivated by traditional Japanese concepts of honor and obligation that their parents had instilled. The War Department initially planned to form a single regiment of Japanese-American volunteers. They received more than 10,000 applications from the camps and from Hawaii, where Japanese Americans had not been mass incarcerated, and where many already served in the Hawaii Territorial Guard before being removed after Pearl Harbor. The response exceeded expectations dramatically. On January 23, 1943, the War Department activated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The designation was deliberate. The Army had previously designated 4 numbered regiments, the 77th through 80th, as segregated Japanese-American units in World War I, though these never saw combat. To avoid confusion and to signal this was something new, the Army skipped to 442. Someone in the War Department had a sense of irony. The digits 442 in Japanese could be read as shi ni, which resembled shini, meaning death. The 442 absorbed the 100th Infantry Battalion, a unit formed earlier from Hawaii National Guard troops. The 100th had already deployed to North Africa and Italy, earning the nickname Purple Heart Battalion for its casualty rate. These combat veterans would provide the core experience around which the 442 would build its reputation. Camp Shelby occupied over 134,000 acres in southern Mississippi. The base had been reactivated in 1940 to train infantry divisions for the expanding army. When the Nisei soldiers arrived, they found a typical army training facility: tar paper barracks, obstacle courses, rifle ranges, and the red clay mud that characterized Mississippi in winter. What they also found was Jim Crow segregation. Mississippi in 1943 enforced strict racial separation. Japanese Americans occupied an ambiguous position in this system. They were not white, but they were not black either. Local establishments often refused to serve them. Signs reading "No Japs Allowed" appeared in store windows in nearby Hattiesburg. Some businesses would serve them, others would not. The inconsistency was perhaps more degrading than uniform exclusion would have been. The soldiers responded by focusing on training with an intensity that impressed even skeptical regular army officers. The regimental commander, Colonel Charles Pence, was a white officer from the regular army. The War Department did not trust Japanese Americans to command themselves, but Pence and his staff quickly recognized they were training highly motivated soldiers. The training regimen was standard infantry preparation, but compressed and intensified. Basic rifle marksmanship on ranges where men fired thousands of rounds until they could hit targets at 500 yards. Squad tactics, learning to move as coordinated units under fire. Platoon and company maneuvers, larger formations working together. Physical conditioning, forced marches with full packs covering 20 miles in a day. Bayonet training, learning to kill with bladed weapons. Live fire exercises where men crawled under machine gun fire while explosives detonated around them. The weapons were standard American infantry issue. The Moni Garand rifle, a semi-automatic rifle firing .30-06 ammunition from an 8-round clip. The weapon was heavier than the bolt-action rifles other nations used, weighing 9.5 pounds unloaded, but its rate of fire gave American infantry a significant advantage. Each soldier also carried a bayonet, a steel helmet, a musette bag for rations and personal items, a cartridge belt with 10 pockets, each holding an 8-round clip, a canteen, an entrenching tool, and a first aid pouch. Squad automatic. Weapons included the Browning automatic rifle, known as the BAR, a magazine-fed light machine gun that provided mobile firepower. Each infantry squad had one BAR gunner. The weapon fired the same 30-06 round as the Garand, but from a 20-round magazine, capable of sustained automatic fire at 400 to 600 rounds per minute. The 442 trained as a complete regimental combat team, meaning it included not just infantry, but attached artillery, engineers, and medical units. The artillery battalion operated M2A1 howitzers, 105mm guns capable of firing high-explosive shells to ranges exceeding 7 miles. The engineer company trained in demolitions, mine clearing, and bridge construction. The medical detachment learned to treat battlefield wounds under fire. In May 1944, the 442nd deployed to Italy. They landed at Naples and moved north to join the Fifth Army fighting up the Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign was grinding, costly warfare. Germany had fortified mountain positions across Italy, forcing the Allies to assault uphill against prepared defences. The terrain favoured defence. Every ridge offered observation over the valleys below. Every river provided a natural obstacle. The weather alternated between mud and dust, heat and cold. The 442 entered combat in June, near the town of Suvereto. Their objective was to break through German positions in the hills and advance toward Livorno. The Germans defending these positions were experienced troops from regular Wehrmacht divisions, supplemented by Italian fascist militia. They had constructed bunkers, laid minefields, registered artillery on likely approach routes, and prepared defensive fires to stop any assault. The Nisei soldiers attacked. What happened in those first engagements established the pattern that would characterize the 442 throughout the war. They advanced aggressively, moving forward, under fire when other units would have sought cover. They took casualties but maintained momentum. Squad leaders led from the front, exposing themselves to direct attacks. When one man fell, another immediately took his place and continued the assault. The casualty rate was immediate and severe. In the first week of combat, the regiment lost over 200 men killed or wounded. The soldiers learned what combat veterans had known since ancient times. Training prepares you for the mechanics of fighting, but not for the reality of friends dying beside you, not for the terror of incoming artillery, not for the exhaustion of sustained combat. But they also proved something to themselves and to the skeptical regular army officers observing them. They could fight. They would fight. The question of loyalty, the suspicion that had justified their family's imprisonment, became irrelevant in the face of their performance under fire. In late June, the 442 participated in the breakthrough at the Gothic Line, a German defensive position stretching across northern Italy. The assault required crossing minefields, climbing steep hills under direct fire, and reducing fortified bunkers with grenades and explosives. The regiment lost 300 men in the first 3 days of fighting, but captured their objectives, breaking through positions that had held for months. German prisoners captured during these operations expressed surprise at their captors. They had expected American troops, but these soldiers looked Japanese. Some refused to believe they were fighting for America. German intelligence officers interrogating captured Nisei soldiers often began by assuming they were Japanese nationals pressed into American service. The reality, that these were American citizens volunteering to fight, contradicted everything German propaganda had taught about American racial divisions. The German Seventh Army issued intelligence summaries describing the 442 as a regiment of Japanese fanatics and warned units facing them to expect aggressive assault tactics and high combat motivation. This was not the assessment German intelligence made of unreliable troops. This was the assessment made of elite infantry. By September 1944, the 442 had been in continuous combat for 3 months. The regiment had suffered over 1,200 casualties and received over 1,500 replacements, meaning the unit had already cycled through more than its original strength once. Combat exhaustion affected everyone. Men developed the 1,000-yard stare, the dissociation that comes from sustained exposure to death. But the mission continued. In September, the regiment received orders to redeploy from Italy to France. The Allied advance across France had stalled in the Vosges Mountains, a heavily forested region along the Franco-German border. German forces had established defensive positions in the mountains and were inflicting heavy casualties on American units attempting to advance. The 442 would join the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard division that had suffered severe losses in previous fighting. The Vosges Mountains in October 1944 were a nightmare of terrain and weather. Dense forests limited visibility to 50 yards or less. The ground was steep, with slopes of 30 to 40 degrees common. Logging roads provided the only routes for vehicles, making them natural ambush sites. The weather had turned cold and wet. Constant rain turned the ground to mud. Men lived in waterlogged foxholes, never dry, never warm. Trench-foot disabled soldiers as effectively as enemy bullets. The German forces defending the Vosges were experienced troops from the 19th Army. They had constructed bunkers using the heavy timber available in the forests. They had fields of fire along every approach. They registered their artillery on trail junctions and clearings. Mines protected the approaches to every position. The defenders had the advantage of observation, firing down on attackers who had to advance uphill through mud and fallen trees. On October 24, 1944, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a unit from the 36th Division, advanced beyond the main American lines pursuing retreating German forces. The battalion, numbering approximately 275 men, moved quickly through the forest, following what appeared to be a German withdrawal. By nightfall, they had advanced nearly 4 miles beyond supporting units. Then German forces counterattacked, moving in behind the battalion and cutting it off from American lines. The 141st's 1st Battalion suddenly found itself surrounded, miles from help, with German forces controlling all routes back to American positions. They were trapped in a position that would become known as the Lost Battalion, though they were never actually lost. Everyone knew exactly where they were. The problem was reaching them. The surrounded men established a defensive perimeter on a hillside. They had limited ammunition, minimal food, and no water source. The German forces surrounding them began systematic attacks, probing the perimeter, calling on them to surrender, firing artillery into their position. Casualties mounted. By the second day, the battalion had lost over 50 men killed or wounded and was running out of ammunition and medical supplies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 36th Division commander ordered multiple relief attempts. Other battalions attacked toward the surrounded unit but were stopped by German defences with heavy losses. After 3 days, over 500 men had become casualties in failed rescue attempts. The Lost Battalion remained cut off, its situation increasingly desperate. On October 27th, the division commander turned to the 442nd. The Nisei regiment received orders to break through German lines and reach the surrounded battalion. The distance was less than 1 mile in a straight line. Through the German-held forest, that mile might as well have been 10. The 442nd attacked on October 27th. The advance was measured in yards per hour. German machine gun positions covered every approach. Trees burst from artillery strikes, sending shrapnel and wooden splinters through the air. Mines exploded under men's feet. The regiment advanced by assault tactics, suppressing enemy positions with automatic weapons fire, while other squads maneuvered to flanking positions, reducing each bunker individually with grenades and direct fire. Casualties were immediate and constant. The regimental medical detachment worked continuously, treating wounded men under fire, evacuating those who could be moved, giving morphine to those who could not. Soldiers stepped over the bodies of friends to continue the advance. Squad leaders became casualties and were replaced by the next senior man, who often became a casualty within hours. By October 30th, after 4 days of continuous assault, The 442nd had advanced half a mile. The regiment had suffered over 400 casualties. Companies that had started with 180 men were down to fewer than 100 effectives, but they continued attacking. The determination that had characterized their training, that had carried them through the Italian campaign, now drove them forward through losses that would have broken other units. On the morning of October 30th, lead elements of the 442nd made contact with the lost battalion's perimeter. The surrounded troops, who had been cut off for 6 days, heard shouting in English through the forest. Then they saw American soldiers emerging from the trees, Nisei troops from the 442nd who had fought through a mile of German defences to reach them. The rescue evacuation began immediately. The wounded from the lost battalion, over 140 men, required litters to carry them back through the forest. The 442nd soldiers carried these men along with their own wounded, moving back through the route they had just cleared, still under German fire. The withdrawal took 2 days. By November 1st, the last elements of both units had reached American lines. The final accounting was brutal. The 442nd had suffered over 800 casualties to rescue 211 men. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. More than 3 Nisei soldiers had become casualties for every man rescued from the lost battalion. Companies that had entered the Vosges with full strength were reduced to 50 or 60 effectives. Some platoons consisted of fewer than 15 men. The wounded filled field hospitals. Men with shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, wounds from tree bursts, traumatic amputations from mines. The medical personnel worked continuously, performing triage, surgery, evacuation. The dead were collected, identified when possible, and buried in temporary graves to be relocated to military cemeteries later. Dog tags were collected, personal effects inventoried, next of kin notifications prepared. The survivors, those not wounded seriously enough to be evacuated, remained in position. There was no rest period, no relief. The war continued. The 442nd received replacements, new soldiers fresh from training who had to learn combat from veterans who had been fighting for less than 6 months but seemed decades older. The regiment reorganized, reformed its decimated companies, and prepared for the next operation. The rescue of the lost battalion made news in American papers. The story fit a narrative the War Department wanted to promote. Japanese Americans proving their loyalty through heroic sacrifice. But the coverage often missed the complexity of what had happened. These men had not volunteered to prove anything. They had volunteered for reasons as varied as the individuals themselves. They had fought effectively because they were well-trained, well-led, and motivated by the same factors that motivate soldiers in any war: loyalty to their comrades, professional pride, and the desire to survive by completing the mission. German intelligence assessments of the 442nd changed after the Vosges. The propaganda leaflets, calling them traitors, stopped. German commanders facing the regiment recognized they were confronting elite troops with high combat motivation and aggressive tactics. Captured German officers, when interrogated, spoke of the 442nd with professional respect, the acknowledgement one infantry soldier gives another who has proven themselves in battle. The regiment continued fighting through the winter of 1944 into 1945. They participated in the liberation of Bruyères, a French town held by German forces. They fought through the Vosges toward the German border. In April 1945, they returned to Italy for the final Allied offensive against the Gothic Line. They were there when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The final casualty figures for the 442nd were unprecedented for a unit of its size. The regiment suffered over 9,400 Purple Hearts awarded for wounds received in combat. The unit had a casualty rate of 314%, meaning it had to be replaced more than 3 times over during its combat service. 18,000 individual decorations were awarded to members of the regiment: 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 22 Legion of Merit Medals, 15 Soldiers' Medals, 4,000 Combat Infantryman Badges. When the war ended and the 442nd returned to the United States, The soldiers discovered that victory in Europe did not translate to victory over discrimination at home. The camps had closed, the barbed wire had come down, but the prejudice that had justified internment remained embedded in American society. Returning veterans found their families had lost everything. Properties sold under duress during evacuation had not been recovered. Businesses were gone. Japanese American communities on the West Coast had been scattered. Some families had relocated to other states rather than return to California, Oregon, or Washington. The cohesive ethnic enclaves that had existed before the war had been destroyed, not by enemy action but by American policy. Veterans themselves faced continued discrimination despite their service records. Daniel Inouye, who had lost his right arm to a German grenade in Italy and would receive the Medal of Honor, walked into a barbershop in San Francisco, still wearing his army uniform with captain's bars and ribbons. The barber told him, "We don't cut Jap hair." Spark Matsunaga, another 442nd veteran who would later serve in Congress, was refused service at a restaurant in Texas while traveling home in uniform. The sign in the window read, "No Japs allowed." These were men who had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star. They had fought through Italy and France. They had suffered wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives, and they were being refused haircuts and meals because of their ancestry. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They had proved their loyalty in the most extreme way possible, through blood and sacrifice, and it had changed nothing in the minds of many Americans. The military recognized their service. The 442nd received 7 Presidential Unit citations, the highest unit award in the American military. The regiment was invited to march in parades. Military leaders spoke publicly about their courage and sacrifice, but recognition from the military establishment did not translate to acceptance in civilian society. Many veterans chose not to speak about their wartime service. The pain of having fought for a country that continued to reject them was too great. They returned to their communities, found work where they could, raised families, and tried to build lives. They dealt with combat trauma without the benefit of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. They carried physical wounds and psychological scars in silence. The Japanese American community as a whole adopted a strategy of quiet assimilation. The Japanese American Citizens League encouraged members to be model minorities, to work hard, to avoid calling attention to themselves, to prove their Americanness through conformity and achievement. This strategy had costs. It suppressed discussion of the injustice of internment. It placed the burden of proving loyalty on the victims rather than holding the government accountable for constitutional violations. For decades, the internment was barely discussed in American schools. History textbooks mentioned it briefly, if at all, usually framing it as a wartime necessity or understandable overreaction to Pearl Harbor. The constitutional violations, the property losses, the psychological damage, the fundamental injustice of imprisoning citizens without charge or trial received little attention. The story of the 442nd was sometimes taught as an example of loyalty and heroism, but often without the full context of what these men had been fighting against both abroad and at home. The political reckoning came slowly. In 1976, President Gerald Ford formally rescinded Executive Order 9066, acknowledging it had been wrong. In 1980, Congress established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to investigate the internment. The commission heard testimony from former internees, reviewed documents, and issued a report in 1983, concluding that internment had been caused by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership rather than military necessity. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided a formal apology and reparations payments of $20,000 to surviving internees. The legislation acknowledged that the internment had been fundamentally unjust and that the government had violated the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans. Approximately 82,000 people received reparations before the program ended in 1999. The full recognition of the 442nd's achievements came even later. During the war, the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, had been awarded to only one Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd. This disparity was notable given the unit's extraordinary combat record and the number of Distinguished Service Crosses awarded, which often indicated actions worthy of the Medal of Honor but downgraded due to prejudice. In the 1990s, the Army commissioned a study to review the military records of Asian American veterans to determine if discrimination had affected medal awards. The study, led by Senator Daniel Inouye himself, now a senior political figure, reviewed records from World War II. The findings confirmed what many had suspected. Japanese-American soldiers had been held to higher standards for medal consideration than white soldiers performing similar actions. In June 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 21 Asian American veterans of World War II, 20 of them from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Most received the medal posthumously, their families accepting on behalf of men who had died decades earlier. 7. Recipients were still alive to receive the award themselves. Elderly men in their 70s and 80s finally receiving recognition that should have come 55 years earlier. The ceremony was held at the White House. President Clinton spoke directly about the discrimination these men had faced. He acknowledged that they had fought a war on two fronts, against fascism abroad and against prejudice at home. He stated clearly that their service had been inadequately recognized because of their race, and that this ceremony, while overdue, attempted to correct that historical injustice. The surviving recipients stood in their dress uniforms, some needing assistance to walk, all bearing the physical marks of age and old wounds. When President Clinton placed the Medal of Honor around their necks, some wept. These were men who had carried the weight of unrecognized sacrifice for decades, who had fought with extraordinary courage and received a fraction of the recognition given to other units with similar combat records. In 2010, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion. This is the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The ceremony recognized not just the military achievements but the broader significance of what these men represented. Americans who had maintained faith in their country's ideals, even when their country had abandoned those ideals in its treatment of them. The historical vindication of the 442nd extends beyond medals and ceremonies. The regiment's story has become central to teaching about World War II and about civil liberties in American history. Schools that once barely mentioned internment now teach it as a constitutional crisis. The 442nd is presented as evidence that loyalty and citizenship are not determined by ancestry or appearance, but by commitment to shared democratic values. The German propaganda leaflets that had called these men traitors were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The German command assumed ethnicity determined loyalty, that blood was stronger than citizenship, that Japanese Americans would naturally side with Japan against white America. This assumption reflected Nazi racial ideology, which held that race defined identity and determined behavior. The Nisei soldiers of the 442nd proved this ideology wrong in the most decisive way possible. They demonstrated that American identity was based on something other than ethnic heritage. They showed that men could fight for principles and for a political community, even when that community had failed them. Their loyalty was not to an ethnic homeland they had never seen, but to an idea of America that existed more perfectly in their ideals than in their lived experience. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the 442nd's story. They were better Americans, more committed to American, constitutional values, than the government and society that imprisoned their families. They believed in an America that believed in equality, justice, and citizenship rights, even when that America denied them those very things. They fought for the promise of America while imprisoned by the reality of America. The men who survived and returned home carried this contradiction for the rest of their lives. Some became bitter. Some found peace through activism, working to ensure such injustices would not happen again. Some simply tried to forget, to move forward, to build lives free from the pain of that historical moment. But all of them, whether they spoke of it or not, had participated in one of the most remarkable demonstrations of loyalty and courage in American military history. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team remains the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in American military history. That record stands not because these men were superhuman or because Japanese culture produced superior soldiers, but because they entered combat with something to prove that most soldiers do not carry. They fought not just against the German and Italian armies, but against the assumption that their loyalty was questionable, that their citizenship was conditional, that their place in American society was uncertain. Every casualty, every medal, every objective taken was evidence against the prejudice that had justified internment. They proved their loyalty not through words or oaths, but through the ultimate demonstration, willingness to die for a country that doubted them. And in doing so, they earned a place in history that transcends military achievement. They became proof that American identity is defined by commitment to shared ideals, rather than by ancestry. That citizenship means believing in your country's promise even when your country fails to live up to that promise, and that sometimes the greatest patriotism is maintaining faith in your nation's potential even when confronting its failures. The German leaflets were wrong. These men were not traitors. They were patriots of the highest order, and it took America decades to fully understand what they had given and what their service meant. The most decorated unit in American history earned that distinction while fighting a war on two fronts, and the victory they won at home, the victory over prejudice and discrimination, took far longer to achieve than the victory over fascism in Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.